is a 5-step method that I've developed, again, based on watching David McCandle's present and then trying it out on my own and realizing the power of this approach. There's 5 simple steps. And these are the 5 steps that we use when presenting every visual in our graph. The first step, the first thing we want to do is introduce the graphic by name. We're simply trying to orient our audience to what they're looking at. Because that's the first question they're going to ask. What is this thing, right? So we want to present that in a very on-the-nose fashion. This is revenue over time. This is profit margin by consumer segment. This is whatever this chart is so they know what they're looking at. The second step is somewhat tricky, but really important. And the second step is to begin answering the questions that you know your audience is going to have before they even have a chance to raise their hand and ask it. What you're basically trying to do is clear those things from their mind so that they can focus again on you as you tell your story. Couple tips. Anytime we are using contrast, whether that's color, shape, size, or contrived, our audience is going to see it. And they're going to start to try to figure out what is that contrast? What does that color mean? What is the difference in size represented, right? We need to tell them what those things are before we go any further, right? And you will actually see David McCandle's do this. If we're using a number of colors on our chart, it's not always important for us to say what every single color means. But if we just call out 2 or maybe 3 of them, our audience has the idea that, okay, these mean things and they're not, the important ones were either talked about or, we'll get to them, right? If we just ignore the fact that we have different colors in our charts and start going on to try to tell them the insight, they're not going to do it. They're not going to follow with us because they're still trying to figure out what the colors mean and what the size is. So we answer those questions right away. You also, the more you present your chart, the better sense you have for what this audience might want to know. Also, the more you present to an audience, the better you get to know them, the more you understand what they are curious about. I mean, some audiences that I present to always want to know, where did the data come from? What was the source? And so I know that right up front, I need to tell them, this is where the data came from. This is how I got it. And once I tell them that, then we can move on, right? Again, the danger is in this step, if I don't answer those questions that are rattling around in their mind, they're going to stay fixated on that, and their full attention won't be on what is important, and that's my story. So, introduce the graphic by name, answer those obvious questions. The third step is I hit them with the insight. I tell them, here's what it means, right? I give them the most concise answer to what does this chart say that I possibly can. And this is, as we've seen, right? This is the fruit of all the work I've done, all the analysis I've done, all those the patterns I've identified, and the conversion of those patterns into insights. So I give them that right away, and then in the fourth step, I start building the case for the insight. I start substantiating it. I call out specific points and cases in the data that do indeed point to that insight. Now, for the longest time in my career, I had those 2 steps reversed. Right? I would tell this long, drawn-out story that I thought was really interesting. I would lead my audience down the primrose path. I would say, here's what we found here, and then here's another point, and here's another point, and I would come to this crescendo of, and what it meant was, reveal the insight. What I learned was that while I was going through that wind-up, my audience was either missing me, or they just stopped listening, or I said something that they were like, I don't know know if I agree with that. And they just stop altogether, right? So, when I learned to reverse those two and first tell them up front, here's what it means, and now let me prove it to you, I had much more success because my audience knew the story, and even if they were skeptical, they understood that I was starting to, in point 4, connect the dots and build the case, and so they were almost, in a way, set up to agree with me. Again, when I did it the other way around, and I would tell them this story before revealing the great insight, they almost always lost that storyline along the way. They couldn't keep it together in their heads. I couldn't have expected them to. But when I followed this order, by telling them the insight and then providing substantiation, it works much better. The last step it's kind of a transition step. It's the wrap-up step. You are either looking to transition to your next point, or if this is the only point you need to make, you can tell them why that insight was so important, why it really matters to them, right, to close out the conversation. This last step, the fifth step, is really a bit of a transition. So, those are the 5 steps. Pretty straightforward. What we're going to do now is we are going to watch the great David McCandle's actually present this visual. You all will remember this visual. I showed this to you a few weeks ago, right? And we all had some heartburn over it because it's messy and it's busy and you're not really sure what the story is. Well, David does a masterful job of presenting it and telling the story, and so I think you'll probably like the visual a lot more after you hear what he has to say.
This is the $1 billion event, and this image arose out of frustration I had with the reporting of $1 billion amounts in the press. That is, they're meaningless without context. 500 billion for this pipeline, 20 billion for this war. It doesn't make any sense. So the only way to understand it is visually and relatively. So I scraped a load of reported figures from various news outlets and then scaled the boxes according to those amounts. And the colours here represent the motivation behind the money. So purple is fighting, and red is giving money away, and green is profiteering. And what you can see straight away is you start to have a different relationship to the numbers. You can literally see them. But more importantly, you start to see patterns and connections between numbers that would otherwise be scattered across multiple news reports. Let me point out some that I really like. This is OPEC's revenue, this green box here, 780 billion a year. And this little pixel in the corner, 3 billion, that's their climate change fund. Americans, incredibly generous people, over 300 billion a year donated to charity every year, compared with the amount of foreign aid given by the top 17 industrialized nations at 120 billion. And then, of course, the Iraq war predicted to cost just 60 billion back in 2003, and the mushroom slightly, Afghanistan and Iraq mushroom now to 3,000 billion. So, now it's great, now we have this texture and we can add numbers to it as well. So we can say, well, a new figure comes out, let's see, African debt. How much of this diagram do you think might be taken up by the debt that Africa owes to the West? Take a look. So there it is, 227 billion is what Africa owes. And the recent financial crisis, how much of this diagram might that figure take up? What does that cost the world? Take a look at that. Douche. I think it's the appropriate sound effect from that much money. 11,900 billion. So, by visualizing this information, we turned it into a landscape that you can explore with your eyes, a kind of map, really, a sort of information map. When you're lost in information, an information map is kind of useful.
All right, so this is a script that the narrative